and welcome to Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and tonight I am rejoined by my astronomically awesome associate, Mr. Michael Whitehouse.
Good evening, everybody.
Michael, welcome back.
Thank you. It's lovely to be back.
How's life?
Ups, downs, plateaus.
Side to sides.
But we push on.
We do.
How are you?
Yeah, not bad. It takes a lot to shake me from my deeply embedded emotional neutrality, Michael. You know this. However, pretty excited for this episode, as it's something that I've had in mind for Talking Till Dawn pretty much since we started. Before we get into that, though, it's my pleasure to welcome our new Patreon members this month. Mike, I'm sure you'll join me in welcoming them. At the Nightbird level, we have Alan McPherson. Thank you so much, Alan. It really is greatly appreciated, mate. And shining in the heavens like a big alien mothership, or possibly just the planet Venus, our newest Dawn Stars, Sarah Kay, Adam Morgan, and Abby Hart. Sarah, Adam, and Abby, thank you all. And thank you once again to everyone who has already supported us on Patreon. That's you, Nick, Damien, Nikki, Stephen, Ratchbox, Nina, Jeff, Stuart, Diane, Dawn, Yukol, Chug, Susie, Jake, Tyler, Meat Juice, Steppen, Aaron, Belladonic, and Lauren. Thank you so much, guys.
Yes, thank you. It's awesome to receive that amount of support, and it really does help.
Yeah, 100%. Now, to the strange alien meat in the sandwich of tonight's episode.
Yummy.
This is another weird one. It's not the first one we've done on the subject of UFOs, Michael, as you know, but listener, if you've been following us for a while, you might have picked up that there's a certain flavour to the kinds of UFO cases we like to cover. The weirder ones, the odd ones out. We've never really talked much about, say, the classic grey alien, the classic abduction narrative. Now, that's not intentional. We haven't intentionally been avoiding that.
Yeah.
It's just something I'm conscious of. I've noticed that we've tended to...
And on a Patreon episode, we talked about a UFO that looked like a flying train near where I lived. So you can check that out.
That's right. That's right. I have to admit, I think, for me anyway, part of the reason for tending away from those kind of basic ones is that my imagination has always been much more like readily fired up by these oddball encounters, the ones that are just really quirky and bizarre and break with convention. That's not to say we won't cover, classic grey alien stories. There is one in particular, actually, that I told one of our regular listeners, Bishop, that I would cover, the Travis Walton incident, which was the...
Fire from the Sky.
That's right, Fire in the Sky, the inspiration for that movie, and I think a book as well. We will get to that, but for this episode, well, let me put it this way. When it came to the X-Files, I was always a much bigger fan of the Monster of the Week episodes than the
Absolutely,
alien
mate.
mythology stuff.
I love you for saying that. That's when the X-Files was at its best.
Yeah, and that's what Talking Till Dawn is. It's the Monster of the Week once a month. And they don't get much more Monster of the Week than this seemingly one-of-a-kind encounter that took place just outside the tiny village of Flatwoods in West Virginia in September of 1952. So, 1952, to set the scene, was the year the United States became utterly smitten with UFO fever. This is just 5 years after Kenneth Arnold's sighting of a formation of unknown, fast-moving objects from his Cavalier A2 flying over Mount Rainier. That was the event that led to the first coining of the term flying saucer. That's how he described the objects that he saw. He said they moved like a saucer if you skipped it across the water, and the phrase stuck. And the idea of UFOs was something that had slowly been trickling into the public consciousness for some time since then, eventually coming to a head in 52 with what has sometimes been referred to as the Summer of Saucers.
Sounds like some sort of Yorkshire tea festival.
Or like a 1950s boogie band album.
Oh yeah. What's happening?
That was supposed to be like, the Beach Boys or something. Summer of Saucers. In March 1952, Life magazine, one of the most high-profile and influential publications in America at the time, ran an absolute smash of an article, with its headline emblazoned over the left shoulder of Marilyn Monroe on the front cover, "There is a case for interplanetary saucers." The article itself deals with the disclosure, incendiary at that time, that the US Air Force was seriously investigating claims of unidentified flying objects with an eye on the national security implications. It opens with the following. Last week, the US Air Force made known to life the following facts. 1. As a result of continuing flying saucer reports, the Air Force maintains constant intelligence, investigation, and study of unidentified aerial objects. 2. A policy of positive action has been adopted to find out, as soon as possible, what is responsible for observations that have been made. As a part of this study, military aircraft are alerted to attempt interception, and radar and photographic equipment will be used in an attempt to obtain factual data. If opportunity offers, attempts will be made to recover such unidentified objects. 3. Already all operational units of the Air Force have been alerted to report in detail any sightings of unidentified aerial objects. Other groups, scientists, private and commercial pilots, weather observers, all trained observers whose work in any way concerns the sky are urged to make immediate reports to Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio, of any unidentified aerial objects they sight. Further, the Air Force invites all citizens to report their sightings to the nearest Air Force installation. All reports will be given expert consideration and those of special interest will be thoroughly investigated. The identity of those making such reports will be kept in confidence. No one will be ridiculed for making one. 5. There is no reason as yet to believe that any of the aerial phenomena commonly described as flying saucers are caused by a foreign power or constitute a clear and present danger to the US or its citizens. Now, it's not named in the piece itself, but the group within the Air Force tasked with carrying out these investigations, the same group who collaborated with Life journalists H.B. Darrach Jr. and Robert Ginna on the creation of this article, is none other than Project Blue Book, which is a name that will be familiar to those with even a passing interest in this stuff. Project Blue Book was launched by the United States Air Force, secretly at first, but becoming public over time, to investigate UFOs. And what strikes me as interesting is just how strongly all this echoes the recent Pentagon UFO document, which we covered
it's very close
in a bonus episode. Do check that out if you haven't. But Mike, I think it's remarkable that when you think that 70 years have passed since 1952, the best part of a century, and the public position of the US military has come full circle back to almost precisely the same place.
Yeah.
It's almost word for word in places, that statement, and still we're no closer to any kind of resolution, or so it seems. The article then goes on to cover a series of puzzling UFO encounters provided by Captain Edward Ruppelt of Project Blue Book, along with sections of analysis from Air Force investigators. Included were a range of incidents occurring in the years leading up to 1952, including the infamous Lubbock Lights, and Clyde Tombaugh, the discoverer of Pluto's sighting of a huge cigar-shaped UFO streaking over his home at Las Cruces, New Mexico. The Charles Whitted encounter, where the crew of an Eastern Airlines Douglas DC-3 were harassed by a 100-foot-long wingless aircraft resembling an old-school space rocket. Several world-renowned scientists and engineers were quoted, giving reports of their own sightings or analysis on the evidence they had inspected. One of these, Dr. Walter Riedel, who had been chief designer of the V-2 rocket for Nazi Germany, and in the post-war era was working on aerospace projects for the British and the Americans.
Don't get me started on that.
Stated, "I am completely convinced that they have an out-of-world basis." The tone of the whole article was, I don't want to say alarmist necessarily, but it carried a sense of urgency, of authority, and gave the strong impression of a relentless, mounting pile of evidence building towards something. It closes with the phrase, "Answers may come in a generation or tomorrow. Somewhere in the dark skies, there may be those who know."
Keep watching the skies.
I wonder if that's where, do you remember the TV show Dark Skies in the 90s? Did you ever watch that?
Yeah, I remember it.
I wonder if that's where Dark Skies comes from. It's just a strange turn of phrase to be used there.
I think there might be a alien type movie called Dark Skies as well.
That's right, yeah. Much later though, like in the last...
Yeah, like recently, yeah.
Yeah. So the American people were sensationalized. You got to remember, this is before the vast proliferation of different news sources. There's no internet, there's only a few TV channels. With a single article, a big popular magazine like this with national distribution could influence the zeitgeist in a way that's hard to imagine today. For some while thereafter, flying saucers went from being a mild curiosity or a silly season news story to more or less a legitimate current affair. The number of column inches dedicated to UFOs and mystery lights and unexplained fireballs skyrocketed. And for the most part, the press started to shed the tongue-in-cheek wink-wink approach that had been prevalent up to then. Between March and June 1952, the numbers of monthly reports coming into Project Blue Book from concerned members of the public across the United States had risen more than sixfold. Now, whether this was because the article had led to people feeling more confident in coming forward with their stories, or whether it simply had the effect of riling up the public imagination, or maybe a wee bit of both, that remains up to interpretation. But either way, the article was the lit touch paper that set off a huge UFO flap spanning the United States and beyond over several months, reaching its zenith around the middle of the year. Among the thousands of reports received by Project Blue Book in the summer of '52 was the Carson Sink UFO incident, where two Air Force colonels flying a B-25 bomber encountered a V formation of strange delta wing aircraft, which were allegedly also observed by hundreds of witnesses on the ground. There was the Nash Fortenbury UFO sighting over Norfolk, Virginia, where the crew of a Pan Am Douglas DC-4 had a close call with a string of blindingly bright, fiery red objects that blasted up towards them from the ground below. First Officer William Nash reported that they appeared out of nowhere from, quote, a red-orange brilliance of light, and almost immediately we perceived that it consisted of 6 bright objects streaking towards us at tremendous speed. They had the fiery aspect of hot coals, but of a much greater glow. Their shape was clearly outlined and evidently circular, with the objects moving in a seemingly impossible way for aircraft changing direction like, quote, a ball ricocheting off a wall. This all came to a head with the Washington Dc Ufo Incident, a series of highly documented, well corroborated, and ostensibly linked sightings taking place over and around the United States capital city between the 12th and the 29th of July. On Saturday the 19th, air traffic control operators at Washington National Airport, today known as Ronald Reagan National Airport, and Andrews Air Force Base, independently detected clusters of unidentified aerial contacts over both Virginia and Washington DC, coinciding and corresponding with visual sightings by numerous witnesses, the same air traffic controllers among them. So they were picking up these contacts on the radar and were able to look out and see these objects in the sky. Bright fireballs ranging from orange to white that either hung motionless on the sky or streaked across it with dazzling speed. Those speeds were measured by radar at over 7,000 miles per hour. These objects appearing and reappearing in the sky left observers and radar operators puzzled. But when a swarm of the objects directly overflew the White House, that puzzlement turned to a graver concern. A pair of Lockheed F-94C Starfire interceptors were scrambled from Andrews Air Force Base to investigate. Every time the jets appeared on the radar scope, the mysterious contacts would either disappear or would simply outrun the jets. The pilot of one of these Starfires later said in the press, "I was at my maximum speed. Even then I had no closing speed. I ceased chasing them because I saw no chance of overtaking them. I was then vectored onto new objects. I chased a single bright light, which I estimated about 10 miles away. I lost visual contact with it at about 2 miles. And these events basically repeated themselves over 2 consecutive weekends. The same thing, strange radar contacts, bright lights, jets scrambled, and the objects zipping off at fantastical speeds. Project Blue Book dealt with hundreds of individual reports from these incidents. There are a number of possible explanations, including the official one of it being a combination of a temperature inversion causing mirages and radar interference coinciding with a meteor shower, coinciding with observer error, coinciding with a bit of mass hysteria. I don't really want to get sidetracked onto the pros and cons of all the different possible explanations around this. It's not our main topic. We may come back to it one day, but the point is the summer of 1952 was buzzing with these dramatic ufological events that, at the time, were given serious study by the powers that be and sent the press into a feeding frenzy. But if the July Washington Dc incident served as the climax of the so-called Summer of Saucers, then the following event, occurring in early to mid-September, was its bizarre and chilling epilogue. This event too began with a bright light streaking through the skies near DC, this time in the afternoon of September the 12th, 1952. The fireballs were reported over a 4-state area encompassing Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and West Virginia. And officially, a meteor was recorded by the Astronomy Club of Akron, Ohio. As all this was happening in the rural village of Flatwoods, a group of young boys were playing football in a field next to the local elementary school. Flatwoods is only about 195 miles from Washington DC as the crow flies. It's roughly the distance from Glasgow to Aberdeen, but this tiny hamlet in the wooded hills of West Virginia, as things stood in 1952 anyway, could not have seemed further from the metropolitan bustle and political power of the nation's capital. Braxton County, in the very centre of West Virginia, lies within the vast sweep of the Appalachian Blue Ridge forests. The whole county's population is under 14,000, and the village of Flatwoods itself is home to fewer than 300 souls. That's today, and things are a little bit more developed nowadays than at the time of our story. Interstate 79 was built along the western edge of town in the late 50s. There's now a Walmart, of course, just a few minutes drive away in nearby Sutton. But in 1952, this really was about as close to the middle of nowhere as you can get and still call it a town. It's just a sleepy little string of hamlets surrounded by miles and miles of forest.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah, I'd love to visit West Virginia. So these kids are in the Flatwoods playing fields at about 7:15 p.m. The sun hasn't quite set yet, but it's sinking low amidst the wooded hills to the west. Twilight is biding its time in the east, and one of the kids, in the aftermath no one can quite agree who it was, first notices a fiery red light slashing across the hilltops. The light, which the witnesses described as a bright red, pulsating oval or pear-shaped object, appeared to descend onto a nearby wooded hillside on land belonging to a farmer by the name of C. Bailey Fisher. The youngsters, Eddie and Freddie May, 13 and 14, Neil Nunley, 14, Ronnie Shaver and Tommy Heyer, both 10 years old, are a little disturbed but mostly just excited by this strange sight, and they race to the home of Mrs. Kathleen May, a local beautician and mother to Eddie and Fred, in the hopes of retrieving a torch, a flashlight, so they can head up into the woods to look for the thing that they saw fall from the sky. It's all feeling a bit Stranger Things, isn't it?
Definitely.
As they go, they debate amongst themselves whether what they've seen is a meteor or a flying saucer. Never considering, I don't imagine, that this very argument will still be raging over this case 70 years later. On their way, the lads encounter an older boy, 17-year-old, recently enlisted West Virginia National Guardsman, Gene Lemon. He and his dog join the young posse, and when they all arrive at Mrs. May's house, as well as providing them with the asked-for flashlights, she too joins this motley crew of saucer hunters as they all trudge off together up the Bailey Fisher access road and into the gathering gloom. To my mind, there's 3 general sort of versions of what happened next, with slight differences between them. There's the original version that appeared in the press in 1952, which is the nearest thing to the event, based on information straight from the mouths of witnesses, as shell-shocked and fragmentary as their stories were, and as misrepresented and sometimes mocked by some of the press and some of those in authority. The stories given by the witnesses just after the incident are nevertheless generally similar and compatible and corroborate one another, and this version remains pretty close to what the witnesses reiterated years later, with some key exceptions that we'll eventually talk about. Second, there's the more dramatic version that by the late 20th century was making it into most of the popular UFO literature. This version is the result of compounded, sensationalized retellings, additions, exaggerations. I think this is the version probably furthest from the truth, but probably the version that we would have read in UFO books as kids, Mike.
Yeah, definitely. The most entertaining one.
Yeah. Thirdly, you have a kind of reconstructed version pieced together by UFO enthusiasts such as Frank Fascino, who we'll be hearing a lot about soon, which seeks to correct the inaccuracies of the second version, as well as the misrepresentations and misapprehensions made by the press in interpreting the original story told by the kids and Mrs. May. Mainly this has been done by going out there and re-interviewing the now elderly surviving witnesses or their surviving descendants to set the record straight. An admirable effort that really serves to flesh out the case, but I think this also has to be treated with some caution because I believe some of the researchers involved have their own agendas, which we'll come to, but with the best will in the world, they have their own pet spin that they want to put on what happened. And, there's the whole thing about memory being less reliable the further you get from the event and yada, yada, yada. So in the first instance, I'm going to tell this simply as it was initially reported to A. Lee Stewart of the Braxton County Democrat, to Gray Barker of Fate magazine et al. As we go, I'll talk a little bit about how the later variations differ and their relative merits or lack thereof. So this group, 5 kids, a young guardsman, an adult woman and a dog, proceed up the access road to the Bailey Fisher farm with the 2 grown-ups, Jean Lemon and Kathleen May, in the lead. As they ascended the hill, in a spot beneath where the object supposedly came down, they were confronted with a low-lying mist, a sickening, irritating, metallic sulphurous odour, and a red light pulsating through the trees. They're pressing on through the woods, up the hill, they're enveloped in this foul odour, they're observing this strange light, when Jean Lemon spotted what he first assumed to be the reflective eyes of a raccoon peering from the darkness off to the side of the path. He turned his light towards it, and Kathleen May did likewise. It wasn't a raccoon. From the shadows behind a tree, suddenly illuminated not only by the flashlights, but by its own greenish-orange glow flaring up from within, as if in response to being spotted, emerges a truly hellish vision. Some kind of being, machine, entity. This thing is allegedly floating about a foot above the ground, making a hissing sound as it comes bouncing and gliding towards the petrified group. Described by the witnesses as a 7 to 12 foot tall, quote, Frankenstein-like monster with large, circular, glowing eyes, a spherically round, reddish face surrounded by something like a structured upright hood or cowl or dish-like protuberance in the shape of the ace of spades. According to Mrs. May, it also breathed fire and had claw-like, quote, toy hands. The torso appeared to be metallic, like a metal fuselage or the breastplate of a suit of armour. Beneath that, further down the body, The details were somewhat obscured by shadow, but Kathleen May, who was standing closest to this thing, it got to within the length of a small car, as she described it. She had the impression of a cylindrical structure beneath the torso, flaring out slightly towards the bottom, with like vertical undulations running down it, which, in searching for a visual comparison, she likened to the folds you might see in window drapes, curtains, visually resembling the warp and weft of cloth in its shape, but that's a detail we'll come back to. The group fled in panic, but before they could do so, Mrs. May claimed that the thing spurted out a foul-smelling oily substance that splattered across her clothing. Terrifying. Utterly terrifying. This story scared the bejesus out of me when I was younger, Michael, when I was a kid and I read this.
Yeah, I kind of read about this when I was younger as well. Not in great detail, but it was certainly one of these incidents that definitely gave you...
The willies.
Pause. The willies, that's it.
The 7 of them, 8 if you include the dog, although the dog wasn't the best witness, it turns out, took off running down the hill, absolutely terrified beyond the capacity for rational thought, to paraphrase Harold Ramis. Later accounts in the saucer literature, the sort of account, again, that you would find in the UFO books of our youth, Mike, also talk of the party encountering a glowing red metallic object landed in a clearing or sticking up out of the ground as if crashed. But the earliest reports mention only a red light prior to encountering the monster, as I already mentioned. And that, I believe, chimes with the later accounts given by the witnesses themselves when researchers tracked them down and re-interviewed them. You can see how the game of telephone gets going. It starts with, we saw a light.
Yeah.
Maybe the next publication interprets that just so subtly, just ever so subtly, like the light becomes a light source, which is almost the same thing. It's close enough, it's not even wrong. Then the next one builds on that. It says, well, they saw a bright object, which is almost the same thing again, but we're starting to get further away from the origin. And then the next one, by sheer assumption, expands that to...
It had tentacles.
Well,
tentacles.
You end up there, but like the next one might be like a bright object landed on the ground, but it must be on the ground, right? Or, crashed in the woods. And yeah, you see how easy it is when...
It had a horse's arse for a face. I see how this works. I see what you mean, incrementally.
Exactly, yeah. It's what happens when secondary sources feed on one another. A light in the woods becomes, a crashed UFO with a horse's arse. And
then it spoke. Hello!
And no point in getting from a light to a talking horse's arse does anyone actually tell a lie. It's all just ever so subtly changed every time.
I don't know, man. I think if you get to something that had a face that looked like a horse's arse, I think there's some lying that's been going on.
I think it would only take about 50 retellings and you could get there. I think you could get there without anyone telling a lie. After a 15 or 20 minute terror run down the hill, the group of witnesses arrived back at the May household, and Mrs. May contacted the local sheriff, who, as it happens, was already out on a call investigating reports of a plane crash in the local area. Incidentally, no plane was ever found to have crashed in the Flatwoods area that night, so it would certainly seem that whatever had prompted those calls about a downed aircraft was the same thing as this meteor or fireball or vessel or whatever it was that had first drawn the attention of the boys in the playing field. The sheriff and a deputy eventually investigated the scene of the encounter, but by the time they arrived the following day, they found nothing out of the ordinary. However, it turns out there had been more than a few people up there before the cops. A. Lee Stewart, the reporter for and co-owner of the Braxton Democrat, a local newspaper, headed up to examine the site at just after 9 p.m. on the 12th, so a little over an hour after it was supposed to have happened. He actually cajoled the terrified Eugene Lemon to lead him back up to the spot he'd seen the creature. Stewart noticed depressions in the undergrowth, a, quote, strange gummy deposit on the ground, which may have been the remains of the oily material squirted at Kathleen May, and some unknown fragments of metal, a few of which he collected, and we'll come back to those. When holding his head close to the ground, Stewart claimed he could, in fact, still detect the metallic sulphurous odour reported by the witnesses. As for the witnesses themselves, in the hours following the alleged encounter, they would report suffering from, to varying degrees, irritation to the nose and throat, nausea, sickness, and in the case of Eugene Lemon, convulsions, which gradually eased off the next day. I will say here, however, some have likened all this to the effects of mustard gas. Apparently, a doctor who examined Eugene Lemon and the May boys suggested mustard gas could have been the cause here. And this is often used in an attempt to lend weight to the idea that this mist was some kind of exotic weapon or defense mechanism. Actually, most of these are closer to some of the physical symptoms of severe psychological shock than chemical weapons. That obviously doesn't refute the idea of there being something up there, because if they're showing the signs of severe psychological shock, that actually strengthens the argument that they saw something. I just wanted to point out that nuance, that the idea that this was mustard gas or something like it is probably not the case. Additionally, a lot of later reports, and this again is something that you would see in these more sensationalist writings, assert that Eugene Lemon's dog died a few days after the incident. This is not something mentioned in the early reports. Frank Ficino, in his interviews with surviving witnesses many decades later, was able to confirm that this did not occur. The dead dog aspect of the story, which made it into a lot of books and a lot of websites and even podcasts. Some podcasts actually do tell untruths, believe it or not, Michael.
Jesus.
It's actually a complete fabrication that's been added to the story at some point by an overzealous copywriter trying to give the story more punch. And once again, it's a mistruth that's been innocently regurgitated in later publications by later writers who just haven't really done their homework. The dog didn't die in the aftermath of the encounter. I think there's a fair chance the dog has passed away at some point in the intervening 70 years. But as a local newspaperman, Mr. Stewart was the first of the press to descend on Flatwoods, but within a day or two, the tiny, sleepy village was swarming with reporters and UFO investigators of all stripes, from curious amateurs to professional authors to official investigators from Project Blue Book and God knows what other esoteric agencies. On top of all this, a detachment of the National Guard, led by Captain Dale Levitt, which had ostensibly been in the area due to the initial reports of a downed aircraft, was requested by the Air Force to head to Flatwoods and later to Frametown, about 15 miles to the southwest, to investigate these reports. Why Frametown? Well, that will become clear in a little bit. But Captain Levitt, in an interview with Frank Ficino in the 90s, described arriving on the Bailey Fisher farm at 1:30 in the morning, about 5 or 6 hours after the encounter itself, so quite a fast turnaround, and probably about 3 or 4 hours after the reporter Stewart was on the scene, and he arrived with approximately 50 soldiers. That seems like quite the military response. Levitt reported to Ficino that he and his men detected once again an unpleasant odour on the hillside, found a 6-metre circle of depressed grass, and more of the oily, greasy material splattered around. Under orders from the Air Force to gather samples, they collected small amounts of soil, vegetation, wood, and the strange oil substance, which were all sent off to a lab in Washington DC. Levitt was never told the results of these tests. That's something we might be tempted to characterize as suspicious, indicative of a cover-up maybe, but in this specific instance, I think it's important to bear in mind who Levitt is and the capacity in which he's there. He's in the National Guard, Army Reserves essentially. He's there at the beck and call of the Air Force, but he's not part of the Air Force, and he's absolutely not part of any decision-making hierarchy. He's literally just there on an errand to collect samples. Why would they tell him the results? So I don't think we should read too much into that. But Project Blue Book did have a presence on the scene. We'll talk about their conclusions later, but they again received hundreds of reports over a 21-hour period of elliptical fireballs flying low over city rooftops and rural hilltops. There were, it seems, other less visible authority figures present in Flatwoods in the days and weeks following the incident. Kathleen May, in particular, was visited many times by reporters in the aftermath, and having told her story a number of times, she was pretty much done with reiterating the same thing again and again, and she'd agreed to go on a major TV talk show of the time to kind of give her story once and for all. So it got to the point where she was knocking back reporters from all over the country. However, as she told Frank Ficino in the 90s, there were a pair of reporters in particular who pursued her relentlessly. It was only when they realised she really wasn't interested in talking, nor vulnerable to any other high-pressure questioning, that they finally relented and admitted that they were not, in fact, reporters, but from the Air Force, and interested in examining the clothing she'd been wearing during the encounter.
Sneaky bastards.
Yeah. Shades of Men in Black here, although we're kind of...
I believe Sneaky Bastards is the precursor to the Men in Black.
Yeah, that's what they call themselves.
I know. Right, boys, we are the Sneaky Bastards. Get your shades on.
That's the Scottish dub of the movie Men in Black. Sneaky bastards. Will Smith's face. She said they took her work uniform. It was her work uniform that she'd been wearing at the time, and she described them using some kind of blade to scrape off the excess oil into a sample jar. But they left her the uniform still stained. And one of the things that bothers me about this case, she eventually threw it away because she was unable to wash the stuff out. So by the time people are coming back to the case and going, look, have you got this outfit that was covered in this strange alien oil? It's been thrown in the bin. So that's frustrating. But A. Lee Stewart, the reporter for the Braxton County Democrat, also claimed to have been hassled by military investigators. And allegedly, in another inconvenient twist, the fragments of metal he'd collected from the site of the encounter were stolen from his home in a break-in a couple of days before he too was supposed to appear on this television show, We the People.
Sneaky bastards. Sneaky bastards again.
Sneaky bastards on the prowl. Kathleen May, Jean Lemon, and A. Lee Stewart did, however, travel to New York to appear on We the People, this television show, and they told their story live on TV to a national audience of millions. It was an artist working for We the People who drew the famous Flatwoods Monster illustration that has since appeared just about everywhere. It's such a creepy, freaky looking thing. Have you seen it, Mike? You must have seen a picture of this thing.
Yeah, I had an image in my head immediately of something that had been drawn.
I'll send you a picture, hold on. You see that?
Yeah.
Terrifying.
I'm laughing, but yeah, if that came out of the woods at me.
Fucking hell.
It does. It's almost angelic and demonic in sense. The halo aura around the head.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking that when you mentioned that one of the descriptions was of a kind of Frankenstein monster type creature before you went into the details of it. This is 1952. The Thing from Another World was 1951. Just that description just struck me because one of the major changes they made to the story Who Goes There that The Thing from Another World is based on was to make the alien really reminiscent of Frankenstein's monster. But if you look at that picture, there's nothing like that.
No, but I think what they were getting at with the Frankenstein aspect was more that it seemed to have something of a mechanical nature to it. But in the picture as drawn, it looks more like a demonic being or like a sort of giant doll witch looking thing.
Yeah.
It's just horrific, terrifying. I mean, when I was younger, not even that young, probably like 12 or 13, I had a book about monsters or whatever. And I remember it was, the book was just total sensational fluff, but it had this picture of the Flatwoods Monster. And I remember taking a mental note of the page it was on, because if I was leafing through this book before going to sleep, I wouldn't want to look at this thing in case I got nightmares.
Yeah.
Even as a kid, I wasn't really prone to fear of imaginary monsters or anything like that. But this picture scared the shit out of me. I was scared of this thing appearing at my window. You better believe it.
Yeah. I actually had someone appear at my window once.
But that is something for the Patreon, Mike. Let's save that for the Patreon. But it's funny to look back on this picture of the Flatwoods Monster and how much it creeped me out. Because seeing it now, it also looks kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
And yet, don't know if it's an uncanny valley effect or what, but that almost adds to its horror value. There is a wrinkle here, though, in that many years later, when the surviving witnesses were interviewed by Ficino, it became clear that there were a number of inaccuracies in that drawing that, in fact, may have been misleading people about the appearance and the nature of the thing for more than 50 years. And all due to the artist's less than thorough questioning of Mrs. May and her difficulty in putting into words exactly what she saw.
Mm-hmm.
As noted in Ficino's book, The Braxton County Monster, May and several of the boys, by the time he interviewed them, middle-aged men, would later separately provide him with much more detailed descriptions of what they saw. Descriptions that were still consistent with each other, broadly consistent with the original drawings and the original descriptions, but different enough to completely change how the thing is interpreted. The Ace of Spades type shape was not a leathery cowl as shown in the We the People drawing, but a 3-foot high, rigid, metallic, helmet-like object with that kind of cross-sectional profile, rounded at the back and the sides, pointed at the top, with a plate of glass-like material at the front covering a concave space in the front of the helmet, in which a smaller spherical red inner helmet was inset. So this inner helmet is what's inferred as the creature's face in the original drawing and in the original descriptions as they're kind of trying to grasp for a way to describe what they saw. Which even adds, the original drawing even adds the suggestion of a toothy mouth and a frowning brow, but in the witness's interpretation, it was not a face per se. It was more of an inanimate metal covering with a pair of porthole openings or glass lenses fixed into the middle of it like eyes. And through these lenses or through these portholes shone a light from the interior. The quote-unquote face was otherwise featureless, no visible mouth, no frowning brow, just these portholes or lenses glowing in the dark. The body of the thing, they said, was more cylindrical than the picture on TV, and in describing toy-like hands, which the TV artist had rendered as actual tiny arms with sharp talons, Kathleen said that she had really meant to describe something more like little metal forks or branching antennae protruding from just beneath the head on either side. The lower torso indeed flared out beneath this, but it was not a fabric skirt as depicted. In describing the bottom of the thing having folds like drapes or curtains, she had not intended to describe the material of the thing, just its shape. The material, from what she could make of it, was metal rather than cloth. What she initially described as folds were more like vertical corrugations in that metal, or pipes inset on the outer surface. As Eddie May, the son of Kathleen May and one of the young boys on the night in question, said to Frank Ficino in the 2000s, what Mother described as the pleats of hanging drapes were actually tubes running vertically. They were metal. His brother Freddie said, I think those tubes were some sort of propulsion system. It was hovering 1 foot off the ground. It was mechanical. It was not alive. Maybe inside of the thing there could have been something alive, but what I saw was more like a small spaceship or suit of some kind. Something it was wearing. It was mechanical. So, as it turns out, Michael, what we have here, according to these witnesses, is not the demonic doll witch of my nightmares, but something as close as we'll ever see to a real-life Dalek.
That's amazing.
Albeit like 11 years before Daleks first appeared on TV. The upshot of the inaccurate drawing, iconic as it was, as iconic as it still is, it's vastly popular in Japan. Apparently, it appears in video games, it's in anime, it's as popular as the Grey Alien is in the West. Other less well publicised encounters or alleged encounters with rather more compatible entities went unconnected or only weakly connected to the Flatwoods event. Because as it turns out, the incident on the Bailey Fisher farm was not the only claim of an encounter with a strange mechanical or part mechanical presence in West Virginia, or even in Braxton County within a window of a few days from the 12th of September. In the July 1955 issue of Mail magazine, a man's true life adventure and mild titillation magazine, the sort of thing that was popular in the 50s before Playboy took off. You know, like I was attacked by wolves, that kind of thing. There is an account, admittedly a suspect one, given the source, that goes as follows. At 8 p.m. on the 13th of September 1952, so the day after the Flatwoods incident itself, a couple named George and Edith Snatowski and their 18-month-old baby were travelling about 15 or 20 miles west of Flatwoods, en route from Cincinnati, Ohio to Queens, New York. They were avoiding highways because they were in no hurry, and they were keen to take the scenic route. It was full dark. They were passing by the vicinity of Frametown, as we mentioned before. Not a town as such, not as you might think of it, more...
high percentage of painting framers and...
That's right, yeah, climbing frames everywhere.
Climbing frame epicenter of the world. It's industrial might.
It's more of like a spread out collection of farms and homes and little small settlements, extremely rural.
Climbing frame factories.
When suddenly the car went dead. George Snatowski was able to coast to the dirt shoulder at the roadside. As this was happening, the occupants of the car noticed, quote, a faintly sickening odour, somewhat like a mixture of ether and burnt sulphur. The Snatowskis were understandably concerned that something horrific had happened to the engine, perhaps a blowout of some kind, even a fire that might pose a risk to the family. So George gets out and he pops the hood, but he can find nothing wrong with the car. The burnt sulphur smell keeps getting stronger and stronger, but it doesn't seem to be coming from the car. Satisfied that the car isn't going to blow up with the three of them inside, George gets back inside, hoping for another car to come along the deserted road and help out. The baby, however, just to top it all off, is going absolutely ballistic, and they can't work out what's wrong with him. Just then, the night outside was lit up by a dazzling shaft of light coming from the woods bordering the road. George got out to investigate and found the smell was now absolutely stifling. When he reached the trees, it was so bad he claims he actually doubled over and vomited. When he looked down into the woodland, he found that the land dipped away into a small valley. At the base of this valley, about 200 feet away and partially hidden by the trees, was what he described as, quote, some kind of luminescent spheroid. It was like a frosted street lamp a couple of 100 times enlarged. It wasn't solidly implanted in the ground though, instead it seemed to float on one end, moving slightly back and forth. George claims he was conscious of all the recent discussions of UFOs in the press over the preceding few years, but as a level-headed person, he was convinced there was a rational explanation, so pushing against the stench and against the nausea, he began to pick his way down towards the light. He only got 10 or so steps before a sensation like pins and needles or small electric shocks rippled across his body. And then, a few 100 feet behind him, his wife began to scream. George ran back to the car to see a, quote, figure standing immobile on the fringe of the road about 30 feet off to my right. It was a good 8 or 9 feet tall and in the general shape of a man, with a head and shoulders and a bloated body.
Nah, at that point, I'm out of there.
Well, how? The car's broken down.
Outrun the wife and child. No way. Oh, John. That's terrifying.
It gets worse. George climbed back into the car and the three of them cowered on the floor of the vehicle. As the creature came right up to the windscreen, George saw its silhouette placing a hand with 3 forked fingers on the hood of the car and peered in at them as they all screamed hysterically. Quote, "Then, a few seconds after, without making any hostile or aggressive moves towards us, the creature started back towards the woods. It wasn't walking, and I could not make out anything that might be called legs. The lower torso was a single solid mass that seemed to glide across the uneven road surface." After it disappeared into the woods, they witnessed the iridescent object rise up over the tree line, bobbing back and forth like a pendulum. George claimed it ascended to about 3,000 feet and shot away in an elliptical arc, trailing light behind it. Shortly afterwards, George was able to restart the car without any trouble, and the traumatized family drove a few hours away from the scene before stopping to sleep at a motel. The next morning, George found a fork-shaped discoloration on the paintwork where the figure had laid its hand upon the car. An absolutely chilling story, and one that chimes eerily with the incident at Flatwoods, particularly in the creature floating above the ground, having no clearly defined legs. Recall the skirt or the piped fuselage seen by the previous witnesses.
Reminds me of some of the instances of humanoid figures supposedly reported at the Skinwalker Ranch.
Yeah.
And people have, one of the highly speculative explanations for some of the things that people claim to have seen there is that whatever it is, it's some sort of intelligence that's almost like sending things that it thinks is like an approximation of a human.
Right, yeah, I see what you mean, yeah.
If you imagine, like, if you look at
Mars Attacks, like the women in Mars Attacks.
If you look at what some biologists do with, they'll like make something that looks like an animal and they'll put it amongst the other animals. But if you're that creature, it's like looking at a computer generated face and going, nah, that's wrong. You can implicitly take in all the tiny little things that add up to what you think a human being should be. And I thought it quite funny that this intelligence or these aliens are like sending things that they think can like watch us because they're like, well, this looks like a human.
Hello, fellow human. That's definitely an episode at some point. The Skinwalker Ranch. So the key difference between the Frametown Monster and the Flatwoods Monster, although they're within a day of each other and within a very, very, very short distance, the key difference is the upper body of the Frametown Monster having a distinctive human-like silhouette with clearly defined arms and hands and no sign of any like ace of spades shaped cowl or helmet, which is probably the most iconic visual cue in the case of Flatwoods, right? Frank Ficino thinks that this is because as the creature has travelled cross-country through the cover of the woods, it has shed some parts of its mechanical sort of exosuit. So it's ditched its helmet, it's ditched the body section, and what the Snatowskis saw was the actual creature inside the armour that Kathleen May and the boys had seen. And by this time it's just using like the lower propulsion system to reach this ovoid craft, which I guess is either its own craft relocated to this valley or maybe a rescue ship or like some kind of space Uber. But I feel I do need to offer a wee bit of caution here. If it wasn't already abundantly clear that caution was necessary, this story has, I think you'll agree, a fairly strong semblance of fiction to it, especially in how it ends with that classic horror story stinger, the handprint on the paintwork. Yeah. The tale is fairly typical of these men's story magazines of the era, although usually it would be like an animal attack or someone getting pulled out to sea or, but it fits that format. And these were usually very sensationalistic and did often include made-up adventure stories written by freelance authors or staff writers presented under the pretense of being real accounts. When they did run real accounts, much like today's women's magazines, Take a Break, Closer, Women's Own, so forth, that would be the familiar British examples. I'm sure there's plenty of examples in other countries, these magazines would, and still do, pay for stories. And, probably not do a huge amount of fact-checking as long as it was sufficiently juicy. So George Snatowski would have had a tasty cash incentive to maybe fabricate a monster story, particularly if he was someone familiar with the Flatwoods incident and looking to maybe link his story with it for some extra credibility. That said, until Frank Ficino came along, there was very little literature linking these two events. The Mail magazine account, attributed to one Paul Lieb, doesn't specifically mention Flatwoods, and that may well be because of those differences in the appearance of the creature, which Ficino accounts for with his Dalek suit theory. Ficino claims that in the mid-90s he did manage to track down George Snatowski, a real living man, who affirmed to him that the events recorded in Mail magazine were broadly accurate, and he was even apparently able to elicit further details on the thing itself, including that the upper exposed humanoid portion of the entity appeared to have a reptile-like or snake-like appearance. I had my doubts about whether Snatowski even existed, and Ficino's assertion that he did speak to him only allayed that slightly. My jury is out somewhat on Ficino himself. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I had a slight suspicion that this might just be a made-up story for the magazine. I'm not saying I think Ficino would just lie about speaking to him, but I wasn't sure, right? But I think I have been able to confirm that George Snatowski of Queens was indeed a real person. This is one of those times the subscription to the newspaper archive pays off.
Splendid.
I found the following obituary in The American Israelite, December the 5th, 1996. George Snatowski died November the 24th at the age of 84. At this point I'm thinking, could be him. It would put him about 44 at the time of the incident, maybe on the older side, but within the window of possibility, within the window of someone who could have an 18-month-old kid, certainly. Mr. Snatowski was a resident of Bayside, Queens, New York. Okay, so the article stated, the article that we were just talking about stated that they were travelling home to Queens. It also stated that they were returning from his brother's place in Cincinnati. The newspaper in which this is printed is based in Cincinnati, so it chimes with this being a guy with family and friends in both cities. He is survived by his wife Sarah, a son and daughter-in-law, Dr. Stephen and Toby Snow, a daughter and son-in-law, Lynn and Stephen Rubin, a brother, Roy Auld, a sister, Shirley Lieb, and 5 grandchildren. Now, there's a couple of things there. Firstly, the sister Shirley Lieb, if you recall, the author of the Mail magazine article was one Paul Lieb. Ficino claims that Paul Lieb was head of an organisation called the Flying Saucer Research Institute, a group I can find zero evidence of ever existing. What I did find proof of is that George Snatowski's sister was married to a Paul G. Lieb who passed away in 2019. So, was the Paul Lieb who wrote the article for Mail magazine in fact a brother-in-law of Snatowski, maybe with an interest in UFOs, or perhaps just a good writer, and it's he who's prepared the article for sale to the magazine, either as a genuine account of what happened, or possibly perhaps a prank or a fabrication? I mean, that is speculation on my part, but it is interesting that this Paul Lieb was likely a relative. It doesn't really necessarily shift the chances of this being a true story, but it is interesting to find the connection between Paul Lieb and George Snatowski.
Yeah.
The other thing we glean from Snatowski's obituary is that he had only one son. I was able to find a college yearbook photo from 1970 which would chime with him being a 1-year-old in 1952, which means he is likely the terrified baby in the story. I was able to find information about where he is now without giving too much away. I'll just say he's a healthcare professional in Ohio, and happily he's very much still alive and well. The other sighting, alleged sighting, that this time went unreported and unknown almost entirely until 2014, due to that inaccurate drawing on We the People, is the account of a gentleman who contacted, once again, Frank Ficino, a man who would give a story only on condition of anonymity. Again, listener, make of that what you will. As a child, this man saw something in the vicinity of the tiny unincorporated community of Strange Creek, aptly named. I'm sure you'll agree.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
That could be a TV series.
It would be amazing. It'd be great.
Strange Creek.
I can see this all happening in the opening credits. Strange Creek opening credits. UFOs flying over. People, yeah.
That's amazing.
In the early hours of the 13th of September, so between the Flatwoods and Frametown incidents, the witness who had woken from sleep happened to look out of his bedroom window at 3 a.m. to see a 9-foot tall object hovering up the gravel driveway to the family home.
Alright, he wins.
Oh yeah. The thing was about 50 feet, 15 meters away, and closing inward towards the glow of the porch light. He described it as some kind of machine, metallic grey in colour, conical in shape, flaring out to 4 feet or just over a metre at the base. The witness reported no head, arms, limbs, or anything at all organic, though Ficino's drawing of this helpfully adds a little reptilian head poking out of the top of the cylinder like a guy in an iron lung, just to illustrate his theory that the creature was moving around Braxton County shedding parts of his spacesuit. So in this case, this would be after ditching the Ace of Spades helmet and prior to removing the torso segment, but that doesn't seem to have been part of the witness's description. What he saw was all mechanical, yet also had like a glowing aura around it. When asked by Ficino what makes you think it was a machine, he replied, "It's like seeing a car. You just know it's something that was made or manufactured, and it looked like some type of metal." When the object got close to the house, the boy, I think quite understandably, got scared and ducked away from the window for a minute, and when he looked out again, it was gone, presumably having passed the house and moved off into the night. Without any solid information on the witness, without any corroborating witnesses, I think it's hard to gauge what this sighting represents, really. It's quite possible it could be someone pulling Ficino's chain. The word of some unnamed guy coming via another guy isn't the best kind of evidence, it has to be said. It could also be someone recalling a hypnagogic hallucination. He was, after all, awoken from a deep sleep in the middle of the night. The witness did say he immediately ran and told his parents, who calmed him by telling him it was a dream. The next day he heard of the Flatwoods incident that had happened earlier on the same night, and initially believed he'd seen the same thing as Kathleen May and the boys. However, when he saw the famous picture of the Flatwoods Monster, he was convinced by his family that what he'd experienced was a coincidental dream. After all, he'd seen no pointed kill. The thing he described was mechanical, whereas the drawing seemed to show an organic creature in like a fabric dress, for want of a better word. It was, so he said, only many years later when someone gifted him Ficino's book, and he read the detailed testimony of the witnesses and saw Ficino's evidently more accurate illustrations showing a much more machine-like form, that he realised or came back to believing that he'd seen the real Flatwoods Monster. There were other alleged encounters, albeit very, very flaky ones with relatively little information in the wild about them. Newspaper reports vaguely allude to a monster seen skulking around Ogle Bay Park near Wheeling in West Virginia's northern panhandle, about 100 miles north of Flatwoods, on September the 15th, 3 days after the monster's big arrival. The events are connected only in a very offhand way by the reporter, and there's virtually no description of the monster itself in this case. The whole thing is more or less written off as mass hysteria. And it's probably not a bad shout, to be honest. Supposedly in this case, police weren't even able to find the original witness. It just seemed to be a story circulating by hearsay, like someone heard that someone else saw it and so forth. In Cedar Bluff, across the border in Virginia, some mothers taking their kids to school on September the 18th spotted a bizarre figure that, quote, wore an outlandish headgear and sort of robe and carried a staff. Mrs. Edith Coker said her first thought was of the so-called West Virginia Monster when she spotted the creature just before it moved out of sight from Dutchtown Road. There was no further upshot from this except that sheriff's deputies came to the decision it was a prankster in a costume. Which, if you buy Frank Ficino's mechanical suit concept, then of course that seems likely. It sounds very much like something maybe based off of the inaccurate drawing shown on We the People. The only weird thing is about that, this was in the newspaper a day before that show aired. So yeah, that's kind of weird. Who knows, but ultimately the real core of this story, the monster part at least, begins and ends in Braxton County between the 12th and the 13th of September. There's pretty much no serious sightings of the Flatwoods Monster before or after that period.
See, that's interesting to me because it's exactly the type of thing that, I mean, you said this is in Ohio, didn't you?
This is in West Virginia.
West Virginia, sorry. I think you mentioned Ohio from something else earlier on.
Yeah, it was one of the states over which the lights were seen.
Ah, right, yeah. No, I was just thinking of the Mothman, but...
Although that's West Virginia as well.
Is it?
Point Pleasant, and that's West Virginia.
Oh, do you know what? It's the Ohio River.
Ah, right,
That's what it is. It's Ohio River. But, yeah, it's just interesting because you look at like something like the Mothman, which I'm sure is something we'll definitely get to as well.
Yeah.
Where there are numerous sightings after the fact, and even if you don't believe that there's anything supernatural going on or anything strange going on, and it's all made up, it's interesting that in this case, you're not getting people coming forward en masse with like hysterical sightings.
Yeah, a little bit maybe, as I say, like in Cedar Bluff and in Ogle Bay Park. But yeah, it peters out pretty quickly despite having huge press coverage.
It's the type of thing that would become an urban legend that, well, the Flatwoods Monster, it visits here or lives here or, you know.
And you're right, that is one of the curious things. And they try, like nowadays, with the kind of limited tourist draw of the Flatwoods Monster to Flatwoods, they still have that home of the green monster, the monster lives around here, almost like trying to make it like a Nessie type thing, but really it was just a single incident. And it is interesting, actually. It's a good point, because even if something did only happen once, you would expect it to embed in the folklore and become something that people claim to see. Maybe just because it's such a vividly visual image that it's actually quite hard to just, like something like the Loch Ness Monster, like a dark shape in the loch. A lot of things can be lumped into that, but this thing with an Ace of Spades head and like a metal skirt and big green eyes, it's probably quite hard to misinterpret other objects as being the Flatwoods Monster. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's so specific, it has such a specific look. Even Mothman is kind of a big shapeless blob with eyes, but the Flatwoods Monster has such a specific sort of silhouette. I don't know, like I just don't know why it has never really caught on as a sort of continuing monster legend, but maybe that's why. But yeah, it's a really good point. It's pretty much all within those 2 days, really, 2 to 3 days at most. So what the hell was going on? How do we explain this? As far as Frank Ficino is concerned, the events in Braxton County are just the conclusion to a much larger story that encompasses the Washington Dc Ufo Incident that we talked about, the Starfire interceptor scrambles, the whole 1952 saucer flap, in fact, as well as several fatal jet crashes that occurred within that window, and the claim originating from a controversial statement in the press by an Air Force information officer, which Ficino treats as a corroborated fact, that US fighter pilots were supposedly on standing orders from President Truman to shoot down flying saucers over US airspace. It would be a whole other episode, and possibly more, if we were to really get into all the ins and outs of Ficino's thesis on this. He actually wrote 2 books, one on the Flatwoods Monster and one on this broader story. So that kind of gives you an idea of how complex the mythos is around this. But to encapsulate it as best I can, he believes that in 1952, the United States Air Force was engaged in a secret air war with extraterrestrial vehicles habitually violating American airspace. And that on September the 12th of that year, a flight of F-94C Starfires finally succeeded in damaging several vessels from a fleet of alien craft that effected entry into the Earth's atmosphere over the Atlantic Ocean, heading westwards into US airspace over the eastern seaboard and Washington DC. According to Fushino, despite possessing technology thousands of years in advance of humans, these alien ships were taken by surprise by the F-94s, some of which had recently been retrofitted with slipper pods, allowing them to launch 48 supersonic Mark IV folding fin aerial rockets at once. Essentially, if these jets could get within range of their target, they could pretty much fill the sky ahead with high explosive missiles. This was a big step forward in speed and firepower from the planes of the World War II era just a few short years earlier, and Fushino thinks that the aliens piloting these ships were taken by surprise. Now, if you buy into Fushino's extraterrestrial hypothesis, that's still a bit like a team of Marines being killed by monkeys in the jungle. But to give him his due, if those monkeys had learned to throw rocks since your last visit, maybe they could cause a few casualties, and that's where the Flatwoods UFO and monster come in. One of these vessels in particular, according to Fushino, is critically damaged and forced to crash land in Braxton County. The occupant bails out inside some kind of combination environmental suit / body armor / reconnaissance vehicle, and the rest is history. It's a thrilling story, alright. The thing is, with Frank Fushino, look, he seems like a dedicated and likeable guy. I don't want to take anything away from him whatsoever. The Flatwoods monster story as it stands today is basically thanks to him. He's the guy who actually got the witnesses talking again. He's the guy who verifiably corrected a lot of falsehoods and a lot of misapprehensions that had plagued this case for decades. But from his writings, I'm given the strong impression that he's great at doing the research in the sense of interviewing people and like tracking down records and so forth. He excels at that, really. But to my eye, where he does not excel is in drawing, really sound, reliable conclusions from that data. He is a dyed-in-the-wool believer in the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And I don't mean believer in the sense that he's open to the idea. He seems to take it as a given. And at times, reading his stuff, it feels like watching someone doing a join the dots puzzle. But he's started with a fixed idea of what the picture is going to be. So he's starting to join dots that are maybe a bit too far apart and maybe find some dots that are not even part of the puzzle.
I've done that. It always ends up a disaster. They also just often seem to coalesce and come together as the outline of a penis. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a strange thing, or a pair of tits. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has any theories about that.
It's another episode of Talking Till Dawn in that, yeah. But just for example, what I'm talking about with Frank Fushino, I was listening to another podcast he appeared on as a guest, Podcast UFO March 2021, if you want to listen to it. And if I remember correctly, he was talking about how the top half of the thing in Frametown seemed to be kind of reptilian in appearance, right? And about how he'd just so happened, after having that phone conversation with George Snatowski, he'd happened to find a photograph of a snake in a book, all coiled up in a sort of conical shape. Like you would see on the Gadsden flag, the Don't Tread on Me flag, where there's like a snake coiled up on itself. And he said something like, and then it all made sense why the bottom of the mechanical suit was flared out, because it must be like a snake coiled up inside. And I'm just like, that doesn't follow at all.
Yeah.
That's just two thoughts you've had that sort of vaguely align. And there's quite a few of these logical leaps that I just struggle to buy into his conclusions, especially when they're so sensational. Like if you're telling people that Star Wars was playing out over Washington DC between aliens and 1950s fighter jets, you need to have something really good to convince people of that. He jumps to conclusions is the concise version of what I'm trying to say, in my opinion, drastically so. That's not to say his books are without merit. You should definitely check them out if you find this an interesting topic. In my opinion, they are an important, if flawed, document of the history and the folklore around these sightings. Fushino recorded eyewitness testimonies and details that would have been lost to time by now if he hadn't gone out there and done that. All credit to him for that. while we may disagree with his conclusions, without the raw facts he collected and presented, we would be handicapped in our ability to draw our own conclusions. Though our conclusions may be different from his, if you see what I mean. So we certainly owe him that much. On the flip side to Frank Ficino, the classic skeptical explanation isn't particularly satisfying either. In 2000, Joe Nickell reviewed the case in Skeptical Inquirer. He visited Flatwoods, he examined the evidence as was available to him at the time. He concluded that the UFO was a meteor, that the pulsating red light was a navigational beacon for aircraft, of which there were several positioned on hilltops around the Flatwoods area. Bearing in mind this is about 2 miles north of the small Braxton County airport. That's a fact that quite rarely gets discussed in connection to this story actually, but it isn't far from an airport. And this beacon would have been seen through the trees and through this ground fog, and because it's in the fog, it could have filled the air with this pulsing red colour rather than just being a flashing bulb in the distance. All of this combined with, a little bit of panic, a little bit of hoaxing. There was a guy called Max Lockhart, who was a teenager at the time, who says he drove around the scene in his leaky Chevy truck shortly after the event, leaving, so he says, tyre tracks and oil behind him. Combined with the theory of the witnesses having encountered not an alien or a robot, but an angry barn owl perched on a branch.
Pretty angry barn owl.
It's so angry, it's gone bright red in the face.
8 foot tall.
And it's turned into a robot. Yeah, so my first instinct is if there's, a solid rational explanation given, usually I would gravitate towards that. And, there is some sense to this, I think. As we discussed in the episode about sky monsters, when we talked about so-called star jelly, it's very, very common for people to misjudge how far away a falling meteor is and to construe it as having landed on the crest of a nearby hill or in the next field when, in fact, it's many kilometers up in the air and it's landed or burnt up way over the horizon. They simply don't burn up like that close to the ground. They do it far, far up. But then there's the issue that these fireballs were seen travelling over 4 states over the course of several hours. Now, a meteor travelling at 1,000 kilometres a minute would have crossed that in seconds. It could be that there were several meteors burning up over the area over the course of the day, but what's interesting is there are no major meteor showers at this time of year, and reports of fireballs over a wider area don't immediately seem to jive with these being high burning meteors, because if several of these hit over the course of a day, you'd expect them all to be seen over hundreds of miles simultaneously because of their height. But in fact, Frank Ficino does seem to have put together a moderately convincing case for sequential sightings of the same objects moving at about 400 to 500 miles per hour from east to west, which absolutely would not align with these being meteors. He has a map and everything where he's plotted out the supposed routes. You got to have a map, right?
Aye.
Again, I think there are some issues with Ficino's overall approach, but I see nothing to immediately discount this particular part of his argument. I'm certainly not ready to say aliens. Michael, I do lean somewhat towards the skeptical camp, but I do find there could be some amount of uncertainty about what those fireballs were. And meteors are not quite the slam dunk solution to the problem. There's still some room for this being something either natural but non-meteor, artificial man-made, or artificial other, crossing over the US eastern seaboard at that time. As for the owl, well, if I squint I can see it. I think a blind spot for a lot of hardline believers is in accepting how much human perception can be shaped by fear and disorientation and stress, and how the imagination and the power of suggestion and the hidden gaps of memory can all very provably, very demonstrably combine to create an impression of something that's way off what actually occurred. And you don't have to be some kind of idiot for that to happen to you. That can happen to the best of us. Perception is flawed. So I could sort of see that maybe happening, someone mistaking a barn owl for a monster. It's high up on a tree, it hisses at them, it has these small talons gripping the branch, like the little small hands of the monster. It has reflective eyes. It has this striking circular face. Maybe the vegetation around it gives the impression of a cowl and a strange body underneath it.
Very skeptical of all that, to be honest. That seems like a massive stretch.
Well,
I'd rather just say that people made it up.
No, I genuinely don't think they made it up. I'm pretty convinced that they saw something.
I'm not saying they did, right? But I think, I don't know. I mean, are these people that live in the area?
Yeah, but you're not talking about woodsmen. They are people that live in a town, you know. Mostly kids. There are kids and a beautician. So you're not talking.
Oh,
you're not talking like, you know.
Do you know? I'm forgetting that they're mostly kids. Okay,
Yeah.
right. So fair enough. That adds a little bit more credence to it. But I do think sometimes, absolutely, fear and anxiety can absolutely shape your perceptions and your interpretation of things. However, it sounded like they got a good look at this thing. It's not like something appears and someone's like, "Shit! Look at that! Run!" You know, and everyone runs, and then it's like, do you remember what that was? It just, sometimes I think that, you know, with the desire to give a rational explanation for something, sometimes I think it stretches credibility to me.
I agree with that. But what I would say is that it's actually hard to interpret exactly how long they observed this creature for. And you've got to remember the context. They're up there, they see this thing, they're scared and they run away. And they're running down the hill for quite some time before they get home. So they've got perhaps time to talk to each other and to share, what did you see? I thought I saw this. And kind of between them all to share a story and completely unconsciously concoct a sort of larger kind of...
It was an alien. No, it was an alien.
more complex encounter. The amount of detail in the description gives the impression that they were standing and looking at it for a long time. But I don't think they were. I think they pretty much, it came out at them and they ran away.
I suppose that'd be your standard response. Something like that came out.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But you're right, it doesn't explain the mechanical appearance. It doesn't explain the stuff on Kathleen May's clothes, although we don't have the clothes. It doesn't explain the fact that 3 of the boys, separately and under firm questioning, drew pretty much the same hooded or helmeted figure that doesn't particularly resemble an owl. In fact, it seems the owl-like look, if anything, comes in with that We the People drawing, which, as we've said, is probably not that accurate. So I still think it's possible they were spooked by some kind of animal. I'm not going to write that off. It doesn't rise to the top of the list of possibilities quite as convincingly as I'd like. That's how I'll put it. It's just hard to get past how adamant they all were that there was something mechanical about the thing. This is even a feature of some of the earliest witness accounts and news reports, even when the actual drawings were getting it wrong and showing it as a sort of organic creature. The written accounts do mention it being mechanical, and you have these descriptions like Frankenstein-like monster, sort of robot monster. Kathleen May alleged that she was shown a letter from the government informing her that what she'd seen was in fact a secret experimental rocket vehicle powered by nitric acid and hydrazine, an ammonia-like substance. I guess the cowling on top would then be the cone of the rocket, the head would be like a circular tank, the skirt would be the flared out thrusters. But the origin and the whereabouts of this letter are another huge controversy that I don't want to get bogged down in, but suffice to say, the letter is missing, and there is heated debate about whether it really was from the government. It looks like the drawing she was shown that came with the letter was actually an illustration from an early lunar lander concept seen in an issue of Collier's magazine, which admittedly does kind of have the general shape of the Flatwoods Monster, actually. That's a kind of weird side story to this. It's a really muddy sideline to the whole Flatwoods story, but even if the letter was a fake, when you look at it alongside the keen interest that the Air Force put into it and the speed at which the National Guard were called out, like calling out the National Guard because some people thought they saw a spooky monster in the woods, that doesn't happen very often. And then you have all these kind of strange agents and stuff hanging about, and just the general high secrecy Cold War climate of the time.
Well, I was going to say that there's a journalist called Annie Jacobson who's written a book about Area 51. And I think she's also written a little bit about Roswell.
Yeah.
Now, this is second hand. I've not read her books, so I may be misrepresenting what she says. But my understanding is that she argues that people have confided in her, people who were involved in all these things, that a lot of the UFO sightings and encounters were hoaxes perpetrated by the Soviet Union.
Right, by the Soviet Union. Well,
because she actually says tragically that the whole Roswell thing, that there were actually bodies that were recovered, and they were essentially people with learning difficulties who'd been...
Oh, this was they had progeria and various...
Yeah, and they'd been experimented on and cosmetically changed. And the whole idea was that it would cause mass panic.
They were inside some kind of experimental aircraft that crashed, right? Or some kind of...
that they would actually...
drop there.
They would... I think as she described it, like a Soviet plane would enter into American airspace and essentially just drop what would look like a flying saucer. So I'm just thinking from that perspective, if there were people at the time that were worried about that, maybe that's why you get something like the National Guard getting involved immediately.
What you were talking about there plays in almost perfectly to what I'm about to come on to here. I sort of wondered, looking at this and at the speed at which the National Guard showed up and the interest put into it by the Air Force, whether the government's involvement was something more than just a reaction to the story, a reaction to something happening, whether that be a reaction to a monster or, as you say, a reaction to a potential Russian psy-ops mission. I wondered if they were maybe involved in some way in what happened. And I don't mean in the context of having shot down an alien spaceship. I found in a book by Nick Redfern, a British ufologist, a really, really unique and interesting take on this that touches on a possibility that's missed by the vast majority of writers and researchers who've covered this case, and kind of tangentially touches on exactly what you're talking about, but from the other side. In his book, Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, Redfern writes about how in the late 1940s and early 1950s, military strategists in both the US and Soviet Russia, quote, came to realise how the world of the unknown could be used for military gain and psychological manipulation. In April 1950, a writer-researcher by the name of Jean M. Hungerford, working for the RAND Corporation, which exists to this day, it's a policy think tank that was formed by Douglas Aerospace to provide research and analysis to the US Armed Forces, wrote a report for the United States Air Force entitled The Exploitation of Superstitions for Purposes of Psychological Warfare. This paper, as the title suggests, focuses on the strategy and methodology of leveraging folklore, religious beliefs, or belief in paranormal phenomena to manipulate populations, either as a tactic to win hearts and minds, as in the very real cases logged in this report where US agents working for the CIA and the US Air Force had engineered fake religious miracles in communist Czechoslovakia, church crucifixes bowing to the West, a Virgin Mary seen holding the US flag and so forth, in such a way to make the locals believe the Virgin Mary was on the side of the capitalist West and thus harden opinion against the communist authorities, or to sow uncertainty, fear and panic. You might have heard of Jasper Masculine, the British stage magician and illusionist who during the Second World War was employed by the British government to create various ruses to distract and mislead Nazi German intelligence. So this is the guy who would build fleets of inflatable tanks in the desert and cardboard soldiers that looked from the air like assembled ranks of a vast army so that the Germans would think the British were attacking from another front, or drop their bombs uselessly in the desert instead of directly on the actual army. But the particular illusion that Hungerford was interested in for this report was on a rather smaller scale. It quotes from Masculine's book, Magic Top Secret. Our men were able to use illusions of an amusing nature in the Italian mountains. In one area in particular, they used a device which was little more than a gigantic scarecrow, about 12 feet high and able to stagger forward under its own power and emit frightful flashes and bangs. This creature scared several Italian Sicilian villages, appearing at dawn, thumping its deafening way down their streets with great electric blue sparks jumping from it. And the inhabitants, who were mostly illiterate peasants, simply took to their heels for the next village, swearing that the devil was marching ahead of the invading English. This story assumed almost unimaginable proportions. Villages on the route of our advance began to refuse sullenly to help the retreating Germans and to take sabotage against them. And then, instead of waiting for our troops to arrive, the poor people fled, thus congesting the roads along which the German motorised transport was struggling to retire. The German tankmen sometimes cut through the refugees, and this inflamed feelings still more. And what began almost as a joke was soon a sharp weapon in our hands, which punished the Germans severely, if indirectly, for several critical weeks. So this was put to the Air Force as essentially an example, a suggestion really, for experimental psychological warfare, just a year or two before this startlingly similar mechanical monster shows up in Flatwoods with a contingent of National Guard and Air Force spooks on hand to observe the aftermath. Perhaps the Air Force used carefully directed flares or unmanned rocketry to guide locals to the location of the American version of Masculine's Scarecrow Monster. Bearing in mind that by 1952, flying saucers and robots and bug-eyed monsters were much more current folklore than devils and demons, though the design of the being on the hillside, if indeed it was designed, helpfully incorporates the most psychologically shocking elements of both. Redfern points to the lights and the hissing and the mechanical noises made by the Flatwoods monster and highlights that Masculine's monster machine emitted frightful flashes and bangs and had great electric blue sparks jumping from it. Both creatures were seen in the vicinities of small towns, which would have made it easy for the military in Italy during the Second World War and at Flatwoods in 1952 to keep a stealthy watch on the situations and judge just how successfully or not the deceptive operations were working. The parallels between both accounts are as clear as they are blatantly obvious. The story was revealed in Masculine's book in 1949 and was shared with the Air Force 1 year later. The Flatwoods monster appeared seemingly out of nowhere in 1952, 2 years later, ample time for the Air Force to have created its own version of Masculine's monster and to unleash it too, and to have the people of Flatwoods believe it was an extraterrestrial creature. End quote. Quite an astonishing theory, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I believe it, per se. There are logical leaps here too, but it would actually make a huge amount of sense, to me anyway. It's probably the most elegant solution I've heard proposed. There's just so much about it that fits, like the military already being in the area, just conveniently showing up hours after the event happened. So many of them and such a focused interest on it. The fact that the creature did seem sort of clanky and mechanical and not, you would think it would be super advanced. This thing comes clanking out of the woods, shooting flames like something from a haunted house. Yeah. But just because it's an elegant idea or because it appeals to me doesn't mean I accept it wholeheartedly. You know, don't take me wrong. As far as I'm concerned, I simply don't know what happened. And I think that's okay. I think if we're being rational and open-minded, it's fine to say we don't know. Today, the towns of Flatwoods and Sutton and Frametown are still almost as sleepy as they were in 1952. There have been a range of prevailing attitudes towards the monster legend. Fear in the early days, mild amusement during the media circus, maybe a little bit of contempt that built up over the decades, but I think in recent years the area has been starting to embrace its reputation. There are now a few minor tourist attractions leveraging the monster, which is known locally as Braxy, like Braxton Monster, Braxy, like Nessie. There's a small museum dedicated to it. There's a sculpture trail with wooden Braxy chairs scattered around near the local convention visitor centre, where the centre will give you a free Braxy sticker if you photograph yourself sitting in them all. Perhaps best of all, an annual Flatwoods Monster Festival, which no doubt brings some tourist money in.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's not much, but it's something of an industry that the area probably wouldn't have had were it not for the monster. So it's good to know Braxy has gone some way to repaying the people of Flatwoods for the terror she put them through. I know I, for one, would love to visit one day for the festival. Don't know about you, Mike, but West Virginia in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's such a hot spot. It's such a hot spot for this kind of stuff. There's Point Pleasant, Indrid Cold, the Mothman stuff. I think if Talking Till Dawn was ever to take a road trip, yeah, West Virginia for sure. That would be near the top of the list.
That'd be amazing.
So what's your thoughts on the Flatwoods Monster, Michael?
Yeah, it's funny that when you listen to the descriptions, or you look at the depictions of the creature as being this kind of mechanoid or mechanical in nature, and I absolutely get what you're saying, that if this came from an advanced civilization, for example, you would expect it to almost not appear technological.
Yeah.
Like some people have said that the grey aliens are actually like robots, but they're just people think they're alive because they're just that advanced. However, I don't know, I've heard compelling arguments about how alien technology would advance, and that there's a kind of egocentric approach to that we think that they would advance in the same way that we would.
Yeah.
And some of that's been put forward that, look, some planets have different resources. They have, the same elements probably, but they have different amounts of things. And they may even have different environments where certain technologies would become more apparent to an intelligent species first. Yeah. It's things that are way in advance of maybe we were dealing with when we live in a sort of water-rich environment. And the ancient Greeks and Romans were experimenting with hydraulics and things like that. That maybe in another environment where different materials are more apparent, that other technologies take over. So you might get this strange mix, which is that they may be to us incredibly advanced in some ways, and then to our eyes they may be primitive in others. So that's the first thing when I think about, okay, it's a clunky design. Look, what's it more likely to be? It's more likely to be something that's man-made, but I'm just saying that if it is something alien in nature, we don't know how their technology evolves. We also have a capacity as humans to explain by analogy and by metaphor.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the way our brains work. So sometimes we look at something, and it's the old thing about people would have seen aliens as angels in the past.
Sure, yeah.
You interpret things through the codex of the beliefs and conceptual ideas that are around at the time. One of the examples of this is the way that people have described brain function throughout different times in history. And the analogy always tends to be technological. It always tends to be, the brain is
a computer.
Or it's hydraulic in nature, or it's more like a machine. So we use those analogies of the time, and they're not always quite right. They're our best approximation, because we tend to look at the technologies that we have at the time and say, that must be what that thing is. I must interpret it in terms of that. And I'm just saying that, you could look at something that creature, that thing coming out of the woods, as a sentient being of an industrialized civilization, which is what we are and what they would have been, and think it's technological, and think that it has piping running along the outsides of it.
Yeah. And
also within the fertile era for pulp magazines telling these stories about
for sure
technology from the stars. So you end up interpreting these things. So that's the only thing I would say about that. It would make more sense that it was either made by the Soviets to cause panic as a test, or the United States government experimenting with these ideas to see if maybe they could cause a panic within a small subset of their own population and then use that elsewhere.
Yeah, it strikes me as interesting that it not only looked technological, but it looked like 1950s technology. But then, as you say, that cuts both ways, because that's also the technology that people were familiar with and were able to explain it in relation to. But yeah, the other thing that occurred to me is most of our exploration of outer space has been automated, it's been done with machines, and what would an alien probe landed on Earth look like? How would that play out? You know, it's actually a similar idea that occurs to me as the Robert Taylor incident. You know, could this be some sort of replicator or probe?
Yeah, self-assembling.
Yeah, not even from a civilization, just a kind of autonomous robot that was made by other robots, or just technology that begets other technology, and it's just something that's come. You know, who knows? Who knows?
The only thing about those sorts of ideas that I remember looking at a projection of the progression of our galaxy and when you would roughly expect intelligent species to arise, that if you had a species that says, right, okay, the distances are so vast that we cannot traverse them ourselves, there's pointless, unless we build a ship that is basically a floating planet, or, you know, a continual environment where people will be in that environment for tens of thousands of years. You're going to send, as you say, technology, robots that can go out, can mine materials from asteroids and comets and other
small towns.
Yeah, build more versions of themselves and then scatter to other star systems. And it can do this over millennia and millennia and millennia. But the only thing is, I saw a projection about that though once, and I wish I could remember the details of it, but I think it was like, even with the vastness of our galaxy alone, if you take the assumption, it's a massive assumption that there's been intelligent civilizations capable of this for a long time, that we'd already see.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. That's true, but then
unless they don't want to be seen,
you don't know what other factors there are. You don't know, like, if you imagine life, you could go, well, if a cell managed to replicate, well, we would work out that the whole planet would be just covered in slime within a few years, but
that's not what happens.
That never occurs, because you end up with different types and they compete, and then, you know, that keeps the numbers down, and then environmental factors reduce the numbers, and that kind of...
Yeah.
So it could just be more factors than we know, or there could be something programmed in there to stop that happening, or, you know, using all of the resources, because if a civilization did want to explore the galaxy, they probably wouldn't want all of the galaxy's resources to be used up to produce countless numbers of probes, so they probably would put something in there to stop that happening. We're getting way off into the realms of like the fucking ridiculous now, but...
Yeah, but I think that we have talked briefly about trying to do some sort of episode on consciousness topics, but it'd be difficult to try and frame it in a way that would work for Talking Till Dawn. But when you talk about that, about like evolving robots competing with each other, the only thing with that is that there are various reasons to at least argue that robots cannot be sentient the way we are.
No, so, I don't mean sentient. They could still compete for resources, or
push each other out. Yeah.
Bacteria are not probably sentient as we think of them, and plants maybe not. maybe not, but they don't have to be. Our understanding of these things competing with each other in the sort of microscopic environment
could just be a mechanism.
Doesn't require them to be conscious and aware and to be able to ponder their existence. It just requires that they want implies a sort of consciousness, but you see what I mean? They have needs and wants that compete with one another. That's all that's, you know, required, and that even emerges in inanimate things. That's how arguably life evolved in the first place. But, you know, that's getting way off into another debate.
Unless maybe they're not detectable because they don't want to be. Then I would argue that if you don't want to be detected, don't come fucking screaming out the woods.
Yeah, that's true.
Do you know what's interesting, Martin? See, we didn't know each other when we were kids, but we're kindred spirits in that we both bought or had access to all these books. There were these kind of sensationalized guides to monsters and the paranormal and all this sort of thing. But I always, when it came to aliens, for some reason I was fascinated by the ships coming in.
Yeah.
But things like this, where it's people encountering something on the ground, for some reason didn't resonate with me. But see, now it's far more terrifying for some reason.
Appallingly scary, this story.
Appallingly scary. I'd love to see that in a DVD for a movie. Appallingly scary.
But then that, to me, maybe that does lend some believability. It's not evidence. I don't want to sound like what I was just criticising Frank Fushino for, where he was saying that because this seems like that, therefore this. I just mean that maybe it does slightly lend it a little bit of believability that this may have been something intended to scare.
Yeah.
The fact that it is so scary, the appearance of the creature, whether as a robot or as an organic creature, is just genuinely terrifying with that big ace of spades fucking hood thing.
Every time you said ace of spades throughout this, all I've kept thinking of was the Swedish band. Well, the Swedish. I think they were Swedish.
Are you thinking of Ace of Base?
That she was.
That was Ace of Base.
Oh no, Ace of Base. I've been laughing to myself the entire time through this podcast.
It was Motorhead that had a song called Ace of Spades. But Ace of Base, way off on a tangent now, but did you know that at least one of the guys from Ace of Base was like a hardcore Nazi, like an actual Nazi in a Nazi band?
No way, really?
And like in a proper Nazi band, like murder this minority and that minority and absolute psycho. And then all of a sudden, boom, he turned sort of really moderate and started Ace of Base and never mentioned being a Nazi again.
Do you know what? I just did not expect us to get to this place, man.
We went there.
Anyway, the Flatbush Monster, it's fascinating. Now I find these stories incredibly interesting. Even if I have a level of skepticism about them, but anytime I hear about, we said this when we went to the Decmont Woods?
Mm-hmm.
When we went there to visit where the Robert Taylor incident, which I did think there were a lot of parallels to that because of the strange technology and also the impressions that were seen in the ground and things like that.
Stumbling upon something in the woods, it's very similar.
We talked about that while we were walking. I don't know if it was in the video that we made about it, but we were talking about the woods and I sort of said that the woods and the forest, it has it can have a strange psychological effect on you, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Especially at night.
Yeah.
I think it's like both a distant primeval home to us, and it's also a place that can hide things that we don't quite want to encounter.
Well, this is it. I think this is something that I said when we talked about it before, but it cuts your line of sight a lot in a forest. You can't see very far, but you can see hints of things. That plus everything else that a forest stands for just really gets the imagination going. And yeah, for sure, that's why it's used in the X-Files and all these horror movies as a spooky location, I guess. Before we depart, I want to give a quick hello to those who have reached out to us and retweeted us and left us nice comments and nasty comments and reviews.
Yeah, any nasty comments?
No, not really. Well, no, not that I can think of. Anyway, hello and thank you in no particular order to, and this is a long list, Frank Crank, Michael Colai, Alex Pettiford, Tiger Lily, James Bowie, See You There, Justin Rinaldi, Whisper, Jeff Ashley, William Headston, Janice King, Bishop, Sarandri LaFay, Florian Bloom, Alexandra Nutt, Flywheel Shyster, Aror, Hugh Langridge, Mobile Al Pacino, Nikki DeLeon, Lizard in a Tree, Stephen Mackay, Nopety Nope, Holohan 256, Robert Valentine, Christina Barton, and Fonch38 Lasalian Christ, all for your various comments, suggestions, retweets, and assorted banter. Thank you. And for the reviews on iTunes and elsewhere, Closart, Phil M1205, Film1205 or Phil M125, not sure, Sky Flint, and Jen in Chicago. Thank you so much. Remember, we do have the Patreon there to support us as well, but you can support the show almost as much by leaving us reviews or introducing a friend to Talk Until Dawn. And if you have your own thoughts on the Flatwoods Monster, if you have your own theories, or you'd like to correct something we've said, or tell us we stink, please do tweet us at TalkingTill or leave a comment on the YouTube video. Thank you again, everyone, for listening, and we will be back hopefully next month with a brand new Talking Till Dawn. In the meantime, if you see a shadow in the shape of an ace of spades at your window, just roll over and go back to sleep. The sun will be coming up soon. Take care.
Good night, everyone.
there anything else you'd like to say, Michael?
It's good to be back.
Good to be back. In the words of Gary Glitter, it's good to be back.
Oh, Jesus.